The earliest foundations of American education begin in Sumeria. That's because the earliest written records are found in Sumeria. Where's Sumeria? That's where the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers intersect, the Fertile Crescent, today known as, yes, Iraq. What were the subjects in Sumerian schools? What did the kids study? Reading, writing, arithmetic, nothing new there, patriotism, and I suspect we try and sneak that in the American schools as well, one of those hidden curriculum items. Piety, and I suspect some folks are trying to sneak that into the curriculum as well. These schools were taught by priests, therefore they are denominational schools, and they were coeducational. So the first written records we have of schools included both males and females. If you've read The Clan of the Cave Bear and books like that, you know that there were schools probably as old as civilization. Parents taught their kids, the elders in tribes taught the young, be they the things that the boys needed to know or the things that the young girls needed to know. There have always been schools. The Greeks are considered to be the cornerstone of society. The Greeks gave us literature, art, philosophy, and science. They also gave us concepts of political freedom and of personal initiative. In centuries to come, much of what was called new learning was merely the rediscovery of Greek thought. When the Crusaders came back, they brought with them original copies of Greek and Roman works that were preserved in some of the museums of the Middle East. Okay, we're back in the Greeks. Enter the Sophists, and I believe one is coming in from the right just about now. And when I was getting this set of slides ready a million years ago, that was pretty cutting art to have a moving icon like that. The Sophists were wandering teachers. Most of them taught what the books called technicalities. And the books make the issue that this was not thinking. I disagree with them. The Sophists taught young men of important families, these are the kids who are going to be the future leaders, about communication skills and about civic issues. How did they do it? They used the subject matter of rhetoric, which is highly logical, logic, that goes without saying, argumentation, and Greek language. Now, if that's not thinking, I don't know what it is. I say, yes, these Sophists did teach the young men of the time how to think and how to present arguments. Famous Greek teachers of the time, remember SPA, S-P-A. Socrates came before Plato, came before Aristotle. And note those dates. I will never ask you any dates in this course. It's important maybe that you know one came before another thing, but I will never ask you in what year did mumble, mumble, mumble. And if in the future you ever see a coin dated BC, you know it is a fraud. Because how were these folks to know that Christ was going to be born? And how could they know that this was so many years before he would be born? Don't be fooled. And although not necessarily a teacher, one of Aristotle's students was a young man by the name of Alexander, who became known as Alexander the Great because of his military accomplishments. Socrates taught thinking. Well, there we are. He taught thinking. He had no writings. In other words, in today's jargon, he did not publish. He probably would not have got tenure because of that. He's known from the writings of others. His students wrote about him. He utilized a unique method of eliciting information by the use of probing questions. Remember, back in these days, people think that the human mind contains everything that the humankind has ever conceived. So therefore, what Socrates was trying to do was release that information that was contained. Among his flaws, Socrates was very critical of local politics, and he would come into town and teach the kids, and the kids would love him, but the politicians would hate him because he would get in snide little digs in his instruction to the young. Because of that, he got into trouble eventually, and ultimately is forced to choose between hemlock or early retirement. Either stop teaching forever or drink this cup of hemlock. And thus, Socrates becomes education's first martyr, shall we say. Plato was a student of Socrates. He's the most widely known student of Socrates. As a matter of fact, we know of Socrates through Plato. Plato wrote about my teacher and named him. Both Socrates and Plato were idealists, and I tried to say this a little earlier. Let me try again. Idealists believed that everything mankind had experienced and accomplished was contained within the human brain. Therefore, it was the duty of the teacher to release that. Going along with this idealism, one of Plato's best lessons is his allegory of the cave, where the people see the shadows reflected from the fire onto the back wall of the cave and think that those moving shadows are what is real. They don't know what's outside the cave because they have never ventured out there. To Plato, reality is in the mind of the beholder. Outside doesn't exist because the people have never experienced it. Plato called his school the Academy, and we will see that name comes back later on. Ben Franklin named his school the Academy, quite possibly because he had read Plato. Aristotle was Plato's most famous student. Aristotle didn't have his own school, but he taught in the town garden. They called that school the Lyceum, and that name too will come back and be used in American education. Aristotle differed from Plato because he was a realist. To him, the world was that which we can see, touch, feel, smell, all using our senses. He wants us to get involved with reality. He said, you are what you repeatedly do. What you do, you become better at and better at and better at and better at. And ultimately, you may come to be known by that. What have we learned new since Plato and Aristotle? Probably not much. Perhaps Jesus brought in some new ideas. Newton, perhaps Einstein. Very few people have contributed to what Plato and Aristotle had already begun to discuss. Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle, conquered most of the known world during his lifetime. He founded the African city of Alexandria, which obviously was named after him. In Alexandria was a museum. It was that museum and others like it that compiled what there was to know about Greek and Roman thought. And when the Crusaders came through Alexandria and other cities like it and went into the museums, they rediscovered all these wonderful books and ideas of the Greeks and later the Romans and brought those back to Europe. So this accounts for the passage and preservation of Greek and Roman learning.